as we're aware, you both had symptoms or lower urinary tract symptoms, which presented themselves as having an enlarged prostate. And I guess if you wouldn't mind, by kicking us off, just explaining when you started noticing symptoms, and maybe I'll hand over to Andy first, and then if you guys want to discuss it amongst yourselves.
Well, for me, it probably started about 5 years ago. That's when I started to have problems with sleep, actually. My quality of sleep was deteriorating because I was getting up during the night to go to the bathroom. When I went through the diagnostic process, I went to my GP and saw a specialist. I was told I had an enlarged prostate. At that point, I was recommended to try drugs as a means of treating that, as an alternative to surgery. That I did. I didn't like the experience with the drugs, and I have to say I wasn't keen on what seemed to be the surgical options at that point. So it really sounded quite traumatic. I think that's probably the word I'd use. In fact, whilst that process was going on, I was looking at other avenues to see if I could improve the quality of my sleep. It turned out that I also had sleep apnea. And in fact, treatment for that relieved my symptoms at that point. But roll on 2 or 3 years, I found that I was back again where I started. And although my sleep apnea was under control, I was getting up for the bathroom at night 2, 3, 4, 5, anything up to 8 times. And the effect on my sleep was just awful. So I wasn't sleeping properly, and that's what led me to my current discussions and consultation with a specialist, and potentially looking at ITINs.
With the symptoms of sleep, did you find, was that the first noticeable thing for you, or was there sort of other physical symptoms that you were starting to experience alongside that?
Really, for me, it was all about trying to get a good night's sleep. During the day, it wasn't so much of a problem, although I can remember one case when I was traveling overseas, being stuck on a coach, traveling between 2 cities, and suddenly desperately needing the bathroom, and having to jump off the coach somewhere between the two points to try and find a facility. So whilst mostly it wasn't a problem during the day, I could get access to a toilet when I needed it. There was the occasional incident of that sort. As I say, for me, the main problem really was the effect on my sleep pattern overnight.
And you mentioned then about some potential frequency sort of in urgency as well then. Was that something that was quite common for you?
It would affect me every night. And as I say, some nights I might be up perhaps 3 or 4 times, but it could be maybe 8 times. And the effect on my sleep pattern and the quality of sleep was quite marked, and it led me to have poor concentration. What I found was that I wasn't falling asleep during the day. It was much more about fatigue and concentration, and being able to remember things. I felt it was having an effect on me in that way. And I also had a fear that the long-term impact of having poor sleep was it could potentially do significant harm in the longer term.
And how was this sort of similar symptoms that you were experiencing as well?
Some similarities and a few differences. I think it started with when I think back, and it may be unrelated, but in about 1985, I had a period where I was very, very sore around my bladder and my penis, etc., etc. And I went and got some antibiotics at the time, and it seemed to clear up after about 5 or 6 weeks. So that might be totally relevant, because it didn't really recur. But at the time, it was extremely painful and sort of left me, I think, with a sort of memory that this is not very comfortable.
Yeah.
My symptoms I started probably 5 or 6 years ago now. In my case, I would say two things. One, I mean, there was an impact on my sleep, although my wife would say I'm not a very good sleeper. So in some respects, you know, losing sleep was not particularly a problem, but well, at least as I saw it. But it was a real discomfort in the bottom of my bladder. I mean, it really felt sort of painful. It felt almost like, I know this is a good analogy, somebody kicked me there. It was either bruised or sore, but it just wouldn't settle down. I mean, it was a low level of discomfort, but it was always there. You know, I was never sort of unconscious of that discomfort around the bottom of my bladder. And I found that I also had some discomfort in my urinary tract. So actually, when I went to the toilet, that wasn't a very pleasant experience. It could be quite painful at times, not consistently, but you know, enough to make me sort of go ouch. And you know, I was in that kind of, you know, paradox of I want to go to the loo, but I don't want to go to the loo. That was a difficult one, and that just gradually increased over time. I mean, not rapidly, but you know, I found I was having to manage it better. Certainly, I had to be aware in the day very much of, you know, is there a toilet facility somewhere close at hand if I need it? So there was that kind of sense of I can't quite go anywhere with freedom without at least sort of looking over my shoulder and checking or testing whether there is something. At night, I would probably get up I wouldn't say more than 2 or 3 times, but certainly I wasn't able to go through the night without having to get up to go to the loo. And I tried sort of, reducing the amount of liquid intake I take, because I come from a family where there's always a teacup on the go. And my original doctor said to me, well, just cut down on the amount you drink, certainly before you go to bed. It didn't seem to make much difference.
No.
I did reduce it, went to bed thirsty, but you know, there was no correlation between reducing my drinking and my need to go to the toilet. And it just gradually built up. I mean, it was the physical discomfort, you know, that constant, all my waking hours of just feeling there was something going on down there and it didn't feel right. It felt almost as if I had an infection, or, you know, it was a little bit bloated, a little bit, always a bit sore. And that just gradually became a constant theme in my day. And whatever I did to try and relieve it, essentially go to the loo, increasingly didn't make any difference.
No. You know, one thing that you said, Howard, that I can relate to is having the urgency, the need to go to the toilet, but then actually not needing to urinate, you know, or finding it difficult to pass urine, which, you know, it is really frustrating.
I think it actually, yes, it was a difficulty. I mean, one of the things I noticed in my case, and my original consultant said this to me, was that often I would want to go to the loo and there wasn't much there, you know, so I would feel my bladder was absolutely full, you know, I was bursting. I couldn't, you know, as you said, Andy, I have to go now. Yeah. But then when I got there, it was almost not worth the effort, you know. Absolutely.
And the way I find it at night is that, you know, I can try to ignore it, but then I'm only half asleep.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, you have to get up.
Yeah.
It's just, it's so frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good word. Have to get up, because you hope something's going to get better. You go to the loo and there's maybe a little bit of relief. You have got something in your bladder that you can get rid of, but you know, you go back to bed and it's not much better. And it's kind of like, well, what do I do now?
Yes.
And it tells you to try and go to sleep. Don't stay asleep for that long.
It sounds like And I don't want to talk about the treatment stage just yet. Like, Howard, I'm aware that you've recently had obviously treatment for BPH or enlarged prostate or BPE, and Andy, you're considering it. But it sounds like you've both had quite a long journey of between sort of 4 to 5, maybe even 6 years of experiencing symptoms. How did you both have very similar stories, like you say, with urgency, having a quite low post residual volume, so no urine in leaving or staying in the bladder. And when did you start to notice this then? Was it a series of putting this all together, maybe after, was it at the very beginning of your journey, or I'm getting this, and sort of at what point, once you identified these symptoms, did you think, okay, I want to seek some help here, or start to look into it? So maybe I'll throw that one to Andy first. So when did you first start noticing the symptoms in that sort of 4 to 5 years of having it? And at what point did you sort of think, right, I need to do something about this?
Okay, so as I mentioned, the first symptoms I noticed about 5 years ago, and it was that frequent trips to the bathroom at night that really was the trigger, because, as I say, I was having a real effect on my sleep pattern. In fact, sleep apnea can cause the same thing to happen. So when I got the diagnosis with that, I actually thought that I was back in a good place. Clearly, there was still an underlying prostate problem, and as I say, it re-emerged then, probably about 18 months ago. And it tended to, I suppose it crept up on me, really. It wasn't like a switch went on. I suddenly noticed that things had changed. And once I noticed something had changed, quite honestly, my philosophy is to get help, rather than to sit and suffer. So I went to my GP as soon as I realised that something was going on, and that would have been about 18 months ago.
Okay. And that was just at the point at which you were like you say, you've noticed something, you want to, okay, fine. And
Yeah.
So do you have, was that a similar sort of gradual process, or slightly different?
I think it was slightly different. I mean, only in the sense that in my family history, I mean, very quickly, you were always told to go to the loo before you went out, etc., etc. So I think one of the things that people would have said to me was I probably made fairly frequent trips to the bathroom, to the loo anyway, before going anywhere. So at some level, I didn't really notice it. What would really bother me was the discomfort. I didn't make the connection that there was an underlying problem here. It just felt, and in the early stages, just by going to the bathroom, I was able to manage it, and I just thought, and I thought I got an infection, and in fact the GP seemed to suggest the same thing. So my early start was to get antibiotics or something to try and kill the infection, because they also worked out that because of I had some retention problems, that the urine that I was retaining was infected. So that was the first focus of action, if you like, was to try and kill the infection in whatever was being retained in my bladder. That had an impact. I mean, certainly, the antibiotics reduced the irritation and the discomfort, but it never actually went away. So I think in the early stages, I never made the connection, and I don't think my GP did, really, that there was an underlying prostate issue. It was more around bladder infection and trying to control that. But what I found was that the incidence of me needing to go back to the doctor and say, I've got a bladder infection and I need some antibiotics, got shorter and shorter. So whereas, it might have started with a sort of 12-month gap, it then became sort of 9 months, became 6 months, became 3 months. And that's when, you kind of thought, well, hang on, there's something else happening here. So my pathway into it was more around, there's an infection, we need to control the infection and take antibiotics. That was the original intervention for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Go on, sorry, Andy.
Sorry, Joshua. For me, it was a little more straightforward because I'd already been diagnosed with an enlarged prostate. So when it surfaced again, this problem with trips to the bathroom at night, I went to the GP and said, I want to see somebody about this. I think that I was probably in a happier position than you, Howard, in that sense. I at least knew there was something that needed to be addressed.
I guess on that diagnosis then, do you feel like for both of yourselves, it was, so for Howard, it sounds like it was, like you say, potentially an infection that then has led into you discovering about an enlarged prostate, and Andy, slightly different for yourself in the sense that you had sleep apnea and then it came into this. But what was that sort of time period then between having these symptoms and then having that actual diagnosis of, okay, you have benign prostatic enlargement, you have an enlarged prostate? Was it quite a considerable amount of time and a time of uncertainty, or was it quite straightforward? I'll go to Howard first on that one.
I would say that was probably 3 years. Then, me going back and eventually, my GP saying, well, there must be something else going on here. So why don't we refer you and see what else is there? So it was probably 3 years of, going down that traditional route of it's an infection, let's clear it up, stronger antibiotics or whatever, and then recognizing that it wasn't having the impact that we both believed would happen. And then there was a suggestion, well, yes, refer me. But at that point, I don't think there was any real indication. I mean, I'm sure in the conversation, thinking back, my original consultant probably said, well, there's a number of possible underlying causes for this, and one of them could be prostate. But I mean, it wasn't a focus at that point in time. It really needed me to go to the consultant in order to get clarity around what was going on.
Okay. Was that some of yourself, Andy? It sounds like it may have been a slightly quicker diagnosis because you...
It was more of a slam dunk in my case. As I say, I already had the diagnosis of enlarged prostate, so I had a strong suspicion that I did get my sleep apnea checked as a precautionary measure, that wasn't what was causing the problem. I had a pretty good idea that my prostate or my bladder was what needed to be fixed.
Thank you for sharing, by the way, on the points as well. And I sort of you've both touched on like the sleep side of things and fatigue as well. I just wanted to touch a bit more on the quality of life side of things. So, how was it, in terms of impacting your quality of life, and not only yours? Were there sort of partners, family members, friends, social occasions where you found that this sort of having an enlarged prostate and the symptoms of it was really starting to affect you sort of socially as well? I'll throw that one to Andy to kick off.
I guess for me, the problems came as a result of the poor quality of sleep. I could cope with having to go to the bathroom more often. That itself didn't have an impact on my quality of life, not a significant impact. As I said, there were a few notable occasions when it did, but they were mercifully few and far between. It was, for me, it was all about quality of sleep and what that was doing to my life, and it was making it quite miserable. And in terms of the impact on my wife, family, others, I didn't feel I was the same person. I felt I was more grumpy. Lost patience, and I wasn't able to do the same job at work that I could. I got tired quickly, and in fact, it has made a difference to my career plans and my plans for retirement. So I would say it's the root cause of a problem for me, and the outcome it has been quite significant for me. But for the reasons I've said, it's not so much the direct impact of having that prostate problem.
Yeah, and I guess if don't mind me delving a little bit further. How's that sort of made you feel? With potentially decisions with retirement and your career and that side of things. How's that been to sort of take, in a way, if you don't mind going into? But please don't feel like you have to.
I think that the problem for me was in trying to carry on as normal, if you like. I think that's what we all do. You don't necessarily try to make the adjustments in your life straight away, and it was, for me, it took a while before situations would arise at work. I just didn't feel happy at the way I was performing in my role, and at some point a light went on, and I decided that I would need to bring forward my retirement, and in fact I've reduced my working week now, so I work only 3 days a week rather than the typical 5. So that's how it's been for me.
And does that resonate with you as well, how it's in terms of the impacts in your life as well?
Slightly differently, I think. I mean, if I take various aspects of my life, I mean, first of all, I think, again, my background is to be quite stoic in a way, so that there's a sort of, just get on with it and don't make a fuss about it. But I think the areas where it did make a significant difference were, first of all, sexual functioning with my wife. I mean, intercourse became painful, and obviously much less inclination to do anything on that front, because it was just, it wasn't a pleasant experience. So that was an impact in our relationship, I guess. I think because I run my own business, and I'm fortunate enough to work from home even before the pandemic, but I do work with clients, and so I have client appointments that last for a minimum of an hour. That was becoming troublesome, because I was kind of very conscious of having to kind of guarantee, if you like, in inverted commas, that I could manage an hour without having to suddenly say, whoops, I need to go, and I need to go now, almost without explaining why I was suddenly rushing out of the room. So I was very conscious of that. And I think life outside of the home became very, very different. I mean, as I said, almost at the forefront of my mind, if I stepped outside the door, was where's the nearest toilet, or where's the nearest tree or bush that I can hide behind. I mean, but it was something about that was the most important priority, and I certainly reduced the kind of options that we had. I mean, going for a walk for a couple of hours became a no-go. Visiting somewhere where there wasn't that obvious opportunity to take a break became very difficult. So I think there was a constraint in I won't say so much in our social lives, but certainly in our ability to get out and about. So life became more home-based, more restricted, if you like.
And then I guess, like you said, with Andy, the impacts, on your work and yourself, Howard, with client meetings and potentially your relationship with your partner and your families as well. Like, how did you, how important to you was having, a support network or sort of access to people who've gone through similar things? If you had access to people that were going through similar things, that is, how important was that to you throughout that time?
If you want me to answer, I mean, I think looking back on it, that's a very good question. I don't think there was a support network. I mean, my doctor obviously was looking at it very much from a kind of practical intervention point of view, but I mean, he wasn't my best buddy. There were very few people that I could talk to. I mean, when I look back at it, I'm sure, talking about men's problems is not easy in today's environment. Yeah. Sort of men's problems in that area of your anatomy where you're all supposed to be superheroes, but so there's a little bit of that sort of in the background, I think. But when I think back, it was nothing that everybody talked about. I mean, when I think about my GP, didn't really raise it, and that's not a complaint, but it was only really when I went to see the first consultant that was even on the agenda, and that was very much in a sort of medical confidential kind of, I'm talking to you about it. It wasn't an invitation to say it to other people. So apart from my wife and my family sort of saying, oh, he's gone off to the loo again, sort of thing. I guess not many people knew about it. It's not something that, in a work context, I mean, I had lots of colleagues. I like to think I was reasonably sociable and people would get on with it. It wasn't something that I would raise or they would raise with me or say or talk about. So it felt, when I think back, isolated probably isn't quite the word, but I felt very alone with it. I didn't know where to go other than my GP, who, was doing his best, and that wasn't working. And then, we got to see the first consultant, probably come on to that. But it did kind of feel like I'm stuck with this. And I guess the thought in my mind was, for how long? It did kind of feel a little bit like a life sentence at that point, because we couldn't get rid of the symptoms. There was no obvious cause. And I mean, I'm not against having medication, far from it, but I don't like the idea of taking medication for medication's sake on a long-term basis. So, there was this little bit of me, well, how much longer? Is it, and what are the, long-term implications? I don't think I really got into sort of, do I want to look at the medical studies to see, but a little bit of anxiety about, I don't mind taking it for a month or so, but years. Come on, is that really what's involved here?
Yeah.
So that there were those kind of underlying issues, and I think, as Andy was saying, they just niggle away at you. I can't say they were foreground all the time, but they never quite go away. I mean, when it's just catching the physical discomfort or the thought about it or reflecting on it or whatever, it becomes a part of your life. And it does take up, mental and emotional effort.
Yeah.
And was that similar for yourself as well, Andy? With did you feel like you had an outlet, I guess, or a support network, and if you did, was that super helpful, or if you didn't, was that something that, just your comments on that as well?
Sure. I don't think there's much help available. Support network, I'd say my wife. Who else do you talk to this stuff about? Howard, I think your points are relevant to me too. You don't wear a badge. I mean, people may see that you go to the room, but you don't kind of advertise that you've got this type of problem. And for me, as you've heard, my symptoms have been slightly different. I would think that people don't realise that I have this problem by and large. So, I've talked to my GP about it. I have to say that's been a fairly brief discussion. My wife knows about it. I've looked on the internet to find out what others' experiences, what treatments there are, what works, what doesn't. Actually, even that was a little bit, less than helpful in my experience. So, not much by way of support, I would say. And I think that's one of the things that appeals to me about the initiative that you're taking, actually. Any information that can be shared that others can profit from, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and you both have sort of mentioned, I guess, with the information side of things here, is that then, so, was an enlarged prostate and the symptoms that are associated with it, was it when you first had it and potentially had that discussion with the GP that you became aware of it potentially and aware of like the prevalence of it, or was there some general awareness for both of you before this? I don't want to have or whoever wants to go first, sorry.
No, I think, as I say, I imagined without much medical background that it was an infection. We just weren't getting on top of it. We might comment, it was really only when I saw my first consultant, the question of my prostate was involved, was even, considered. And even then it wasn't a major issue. I mean, it was still sort of, well, can we control it with drug treatment to start with? Some kinds of drugs to maybe I've had from my GP, and only when those didn't work either did we give a real focus and a priority to, well, maybe this is your prostate, we need to do something about it. And as Andy was saying, and maybe we'll come on to this, then the options at those days. I mean, he was a very experienced consultant, but I think in my case, what I would kind of call a little bit old school. So in summary, what he was basically saying was it's a surgical intervention. And I mean, again, I think a little bit tongue in cheek, I think there's some reality in this, surgical interventions in that part of my body, you don't be able to go, but also, it seemed a bit, not severe, but it felt quite drastic. And I think what he wasn't able to tell me, and this isn't a complaint at all, was what the outcomes were. I mean, first of all, in terms of sort of scarring and the impact of a surgical intervention and what that would mean, but also, to what extent he could predict a successful outcome. Now, I know nothing is certain. I absolutely understand that, but it did seem to be a little bit sort of more hit and miss than I would have liked, if you like. Certainly in terms of a surgical intervention.
What I'm hearing and what you're saying, though, is quite large variability in treatment options potentially. And I know from your having a conversation with yourself before, you've met with two separate clinicians about surgical options, and perhaps with the second clinician, you've had significantly more options available to yourself for treatment, whereas with the initial one, you may have had one, for example. So I think what that does show, and I know, Andy, it's very similar to yourself when looking for treatment options at the moment, that there is huge variability across the NHS in terms of what treatment options are available. Equally, there are a lot of treatment options that are available for having an enlarged prostate and treating them with various different outcomes. So there's quite a lot of filling in the blanks and working out which is best for you, but depending on where you're based, potentially, depending on what access you have, it's going to be quite different. For this conversation, I if it's okay with you both, I won't go into the treatment side of things because I want to keep it away from any specific treatments that the individuals might go for, if that's okay. And one other question I just wanted to ask as well was, Andy, you mentioned about BPH medication, or medication, and I think Howard, you mentioned like you say, you didn't want to take medication for the sake of taking something. What led you to sort of medication then? Was this for Andy? I'm not too sure if you did, Howard, and what was your experience of having drug therapy?
When I first got diagnosed with the enlarged prostate, the specialist explained to me that really surgery would be the last option, that they would try to treat the condition with drugs first and foremost. And I was prescribed a drug. Actually, I can't remember what it was, but the intent was to relax the prostate and know that the symptoms would be alleviated. The downside of taking the drug was quite an unpleasant feeling when I had sex. It led to what is termed retrograde ejaculation, and I found that absolutely unpalatable and discontinued the use of the drug immediately. And I guess I had lost faith to some extent in the specialist. I certainly didn't want to go for the surgical route at that point. It really did seem like an option of last resort, looking at the sort of treatments that are available. Fortunately, when I was first diagnosed, the problem, the prostate itself wasn't my primary problem, and it's only emerged now in the last couple of years, as I said, as the real issue for me. I've tried drug treatment again. the drugs didn't really work for me, and they've been discontinued. I tried herbal remedy, and actually I found it made the problem worse. The product that I tried, rather than decreasing my need to go to the toilet, it increased it, I found. So that had only a day's trial. So really, yeah, I didn't find any of the drugs that I was offered satisfactory. I certainly didn't want to go for some of the treatment options, some of the surgical options that were available, and I was really hoping to find some other way.
And sorry, and how long were you on drug treatment then for? And was it at the point at which you were made aware of the potential risks, like retrograde ejaculation, that you decided to come off them?
I think I took the first medication for probably less than a week, I would say. It didn't make a huge positive difference, and there was a big negative, as I said. I never got to thinking about the long term, Howard, and I have to say I'm with you. I'm really not keen to take more medication, certainly not on a long term basis, than I need to. So actually, anything I tried was relatively short term. It either didn't work or had similar side effects that made the treatment unacceptable to me.
Howard, were you on sort of medication or drug treatment ahead of looking at surgical options as well?
Yes, I was offered sort of medication or only one surgical intervention, which was a pretty extreme one, and I think that was sort of the major practice of the day. That was the kind of standard process that you got if you went into if you were given a surgical intervention. And certainly, in the early stages, that seemed a bit drastic. So I went on to medication. I took that for quite some time. It was supposed to sort of shrink my prostate and make life a little bit more pleasant. But I was told up front that it would increase my impotency and it would make erections much harder. And that was certainly the case from a very early stage. So, that was a kind of, a consequence that I sort of took on board and lived with, because, that seemed to be the treatment that was recommended, short of surgical treatment. So I took tamsulosin for about 18 months, probably 2 years. And I just found that over time, it wasn't making any difference, other than its impact on my sexual life with my wife. But other than that, in a more general sense, it just wasn't. There weren't any improvements from taking it. Put it that way.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe I was very fortunate in a way. I mean, it just so happened that the consultant that I saw, and I mean, I'm not having a go at him. He was, he's very experienced. He'd been around for a long time, but I think he was very much sort of, trained in the traditional methods, if you like. And in my case, it was only the fact that he retired and I was told he was no longer available, and I needed to find someone else, that I then moved on to the newer consultant, who said, well, there are a range of options. Did you know about them? And I went, what? And he said, yeah, we've a lot of research now, a lot of updates, and I can talk to you about a range of options. It's not just either or. Clearly the drugs aren't working, but let's now sit down and talk about what is possible here. And that was the first time I ever knew that there was even a choice.
Oh, right.
To be honest. So it's 2 years ago now.
Okay.
And I guess that then comes onto the surgical side of things. So it sounds like for yourself, Howard, it was at the very end of this sort of journey of having symptoms, going through some drug treatments, going through some initial surgical options, and then potentially in the 5th year, being aware that there are more than, like you say, one option available for surgery. And for both of you then, when being informed of, say, a surgical option that is available, the most common sort of surgical option being a TURP or transurethral resection of the prostate, which involves cutting away some of the tissue. What were your concerns initially when informed of having this? What was your initial thought of, okay, I'm a little bit, oh well, if I don't want to lead you in any way, what were your initial sort of concerns, if you had any, when being informed about surgical options? So Andy.
Horror, I think would be the word I would use. I think it's exactly as Howard described it. I mean, you couldn't be sure what the outcome was. It was likely to, highly likely to affect sexual function. And if I recall correctly, I think there was potential for incontinence. There was nothing positive. This really sounded like the nuclear option to me, and really, there had to be another way.
And was that similar for yourself, Howard, or was it slightly different when informed?
Well, I mean, of the options you mentioned, the only one that was available to me to start with was cutting away some of the prostate.
Yeah.
And it did feel like it was that or nothing, and I just felt uncomfortable about it. I mean, I couldn't sort of really give you a logical reason. I was being told that was the treatment that was available and was considered to be the most successful one that was around. So I guess it did feel very much like a personal decision about, oh, I'm not sure I want this for me. But then I felt very stuck at the time because it seemed it was that or nothing.
Yeah.
And I was pretty much at the point of saying yes to it, not against my better judgment, but in spite of my better judgment, if you like. When, as I say, in my case, fortunately, if that's the right word, my consultant changed, and then the world was a different place from the conversations I had with him.
I think I wasn't presented with the same choice as you, Howard. I think I might have taken the same view. I think I'm not sure if I'm luckier, but I felt as though I had a problem that could be managed one way or in some other way. I don't know how to put it better. I really wouldn't have looked forward to the possibility of TURP at all. And in fact, when I thought that I had a prostate, well, I knew I had a prostate problem. When it emerged again, I was straight on to Google to look at what the options were, and can relate to your point about the sort of traditional view of certain consultants. I looked for a consultant who was able to offer the latest treatments. And from the start, for me, that was a priority, to try and find somebody who could treat this in the least invasive, least detrimental way, because there's always a trade-off, isn't there? So when I went to my GP, I already worked out who I wanted to see.
And I guess with you've both mentioned there, like you say, concerns around potential impacts on sexual function, urinary incontinence, and probably a little bit around, what the procedure actually involved, like you mentioned, cutting away of some tissue to open the passage. Is there sort of information you think you could have had that may have alleviated some of these concerns, or do you think, irrelevant of how much information you had, it was always going to be a treatment option you wouldn't want to go with because of these potential side effects?
In my case, you're absolutely right. It was the latter situation. This was absolutely the last thing that I wanted, and maybe at some point I'd have got to the point that I've run out of options, I have to consider this, but I wasn't at that point, and there just had to be another solution. Yeah.
And was that similar for yourself as well, Howard?
I think so, from what Andy said. I mean, I think what mattered to me was the sort of, I mean, I was fortunate enough by the time I got to make a choice that, you know, the pros and cons of all the various options were made available to me. So I think I ended up being very well informed by my second consultant, who did sort of spend quite a bit of time going through the various options and outlining the benefits and the potential disadvantages. So, you know, at the point when I eventually made a choice, I would say I was well informed, but until I'd had that conversation, not very much. And even though, as Andy said, you know, I can go to Google and look on websites, etc., etc. You know, you're pretty much hostage to fortune because you don't know what the information is. You don't know quite how trustworthy it is. I mean, some very good stuff up there, but you know, it's not. You can't test it out. I mean, you know, in a sense, it's take it or leave it. And I felt uncomfortable about doing that. I mean, I don't think as well, when I'm not a medical person, looking at very specific information on a website when I can't interpret it as a medical person can, it was very helpful. You know, there was lots of sort of questions and puzzles I had that I didn't have the answers to. So, I would say there wasn't that much available, you know, without a steerage as to what to look at. The best information I got was from some leaflets from my later consultant on all of the offers. I mean, it was a very specific. He gave me about half a dozen of various options, you know, to look at, and I found that was the first time when I felt I really had concrete information I could trust about what the procedure was. The various, you know, interventions were. They weren't all surgical, but you know what the interventions were, and what the benefits and the disadvantages were. So you know, it was a very late decision, but I felt like Andy that you know, I think the word Andy used was invasive. That, you know, it's an instinct. I just didn't want an invasive procedure, and you know how much of that is male libido and all the rest of it, and that kind of stuff that might be around in the background, and you know you can. I don't know, but it just didn't feel right to go for this, you know, fairly drastic intervention, if you like. Particularly as Andy said, there was no concrete information that there was a significant benefit in doing it. You know, it wasn't differentiated. I mean, it wasn't worse than the other potential possibilities, but it certainly wasn't something that stood out as being, well, if you go down this option, you know, there are guarantees, or there are, you know, there's research that shows that the outcomes are sustainable and, you know, much more pleasant. I mean, it really did seem like Hobson's choice.
And it sounds like as well in what you were saying there, that when you were both looking for information as well, pre, you know, what treatments to have, is that potentially the information you're after wasn't there or unable to find, but equally the information that you did find at times wasn't either in language that was helpful or trustworthy to some degree, that you felt comfortable in taking that information and that it was informative in the way that you wanted it to be.
I think that's absolutely right, because it wasn't generic. It was general information, and that was fine. But, you know, as Andy was saying, you know, I'm looking at something that's specific to my problem, i.e. I've got a prostate problem. You know, tell me about this treatment in the context of a prostate. And obviously a lot of the websites, etc., are giving generalized information about what a product can do, potentially possibly across a range of things. So it's very difficult to pick out the specifics that related to my condition. And as I said, it was only when my later consultant gave me a series of, you know, 3 or 4 page brochures that were very specifically related to having an enlarged prostate and how to deal with it, that I felt that I got any trustworthy information.
No, thank you. With prostates and prostate enlargements, the prevalence is very high, and for a man that has a prostate, the prostate continues to grow throughout life at varying different speeds, which means that, you know, typically the large majority of any man will have some impact of an enlarged prostate on their lifestyle at a certain point. And I guess with that, I wanted to ask, you know, how important do you think it is that more people are aware of this condition and the impacts it can have? So, and if you'd like to take that one.
Yeah, so for me, I think having availability of good information is important. Actually, the this sort of activity, sharing, real stories, I think is one part of that. I think the other part for me is something Howard touched on already, which is just that I think we've got as a society and as men, we've got to be more willing to open up and talk about things. So part of it's about information being provided, but I think for me the other part of it is as just being more comfortable about having these sort of conversations.
And do you feel, I guess, that before today, that is this like an open conversation you've potentially had with, friends and, or is this a...
No, this is the first time I've had a conversation of this sort with anybody. I won't say I can't imagine having that conversation, but it's not a natural thing to do. I've just said I think we should be more open. So I guess I've got a responsibility to do that. But how you have these conversations, where you have these conversations, I think just needs a little bit of thought. Yeah.
And how, just out of curiosity, how have you found talking about it? Have you found it quite helpful, or the opposite, or?
I think it's interesting to hear other stories. I mean, Howard, I think you've got a different situation to me. Actually, I wouldn't have wanted to have had the severity of problem that you've had. So I welcome getting this appreciation. The truth is, I've already got prostate problem. In a year's time, 2 years' time, I could be sitting in your chair. I could be in your situation, where the situation you were in, Howard. So, this sort of information, I think, is really quite valuable. Yeah, it's not for me today, perhaps quite so significant, but I think it could be down the track for sure.
And I guess same question for you, Howard. How important do you feel that it is that more people are aware of this condition and the impact?
Well, I think I agree with Andy and what you said. I mean, I think you want information in two contexts. One is you want the sort of technical information, and that I think is becoming more available. The bit, and I thoroughly support Andy, is that it's a generalized statement, but given what I do for a living anyway, talking about difficult issues in life generally is something that it's, I hesitate to say not part of the British culture, because but the stiff upper lip, but certainly you don't go around talking about men's problems, because it's a sign of weakness. People, I mean, a lot of it is stereotypical, and a lot of it is not necessarily relevant, but it's not the part, you don't talk about these sorts of things. So, there are very few opportunities to do it. I mean, as I said, apart from my doctor, my GP and my consultant, and you two guys, and my wife, I haven't talked to anybody about it.
Yeah.
I mean, no, everybody, including you two guys, are very helpful, but it's a very small circle. And what came up for me as Andy was talking was, the range of issues that the prostate has. I mean, there's sexual functioning, there's incontinence, there's the physical discomfort that you live with on a daily basis. There's the impact it has on your general well-being and your ability to get out and about in the community. I mean, given we're having this conversation, I'll share with you. I mean, before my operation and for a few days afterwards, but it's obviously I ended up going out in incontinence pads. It was the only way I could trust that I could go out and feel confident that I could get through it. And if I couldn't, the pad would at least, do it to protect me. I mean, that's where it got to. And, I mean, at one point I thought, well, maybe for the rest of my life I'm going to go around wearing incontinence pads. They're actually quite comfortable, I have to say, but it's not what I want to be doing. And it took quite a bit to kind of trust that I could wear a pair of ordinary pants again. I mean, it's fine, but I'm just thinking that's it's not something that you kind of consider, is it? You think of incontinence being somebody who is you know, in their terminal stages of life, and you know, is part of palliative care. You don't think of incontinence pads as being something that you wear on a regular basis, because there's no other option to live your life.
Yeah, 100%.
No, thank you for sharing that as well. And I wanted to also ask, and I think Andy, you touched on this a little bit as well in one of your earlier answers, but being here today and sort of talking about it, I guess why did you want to be involved, or feel like you wanted to share your story and symptoms? So I'll pass that on over to Andy to begin, because you touched on it a little bit throughout the interview.
Yeah. For me, I think it's an extension of my answer to the last question. I think it's important that we do share our stories. I think it gives others insight, and hopefully people can start understand maybe how people with similar symptoms and perspectives, you know, how they have dealt with their conditions, what treatments have been available, what's worked. You know, that there are options. Yeah, so I feel this is an extremely important and positive initiative. Just being able to share the information with other people.
Thank you, and yourself as well, Howard. Why did you want to share or get involved in this?
It's a subject that, you know, people shy away from. I mean, you know, certainly in the male community, and given what I do for a living, you know, sharing a story that my mother always used to say, you know, a problem shared is a problem halved. I mean, it's a bit simplistic, but I think there is something to that in it. And the more we talk about it, I think it gives more people the confidence to trust their own experience, which I think is important, because they suddenly realize, oh, it's not just me. Other people have had the same, so they don't dismiss their own experience, as I was doing early on, you know. For a while, you know, it'll go away, or it's nothing to bother about, you know, take a few more pills, you'll be fine. So to trust themselves, to trust their experience, to be open to talking about it. And I think that hopefully will make, you know, access to, you know, the appropriate intervention much more likely. And as you said, you know, we're living longer, so this is a growing problem, like a number of things in the world. I mean, you know, 50 years ago, we didn't talk about it, but you know, most people were dead before their prostates would potentially give them problems. But nowadays, that's not the case. There's a lot more people out there who, in later years, will have issues, of which this is only one. I accept that, but you know, a significant one. I mean, my bladder and eye waterworks, you know, are a significant part of my life. If they go wrong, the whole of my life is impacted. It's not a minor issue. It's a major issue in terms of, you know, potentially the rest of my living life, at least in this mortal coil.
Absolutely, it's all about. It's not just about living longer. It's about having that quality of life, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And I guess the next question that I guess where I want you to maybe take yourself back to is when you were originally, you know, having symptoms, and you were maybe a bit unsure of what was going on, and equally where you are now, so sort of maybe two different time points in your journey. What would you say to anyone that's, you know, at the beginning of their journey and, you know, potentially experiencing symptoms for the first time, and then equally to someone now that might be in a similar position to yourself? Is there sort of anything you'd want to share? So I put that to Howard first. But if you're still thinking and Andy wants to go, please go.
I think that's quite a tough question, actually. My immediate response is, don't be shy. You know, get advice early. I guess that the other thing that occurs to me is that many men will be aware of the problem. They may not know it's so prevalent. I think a lot of men will know of some of the more long-standing procedures, TURP. You know, they'll have some sort of, may not be something that's in the forefront of their minds, but you know, it'll be somewhere. You know, people will be aware. I think the point is that there's huge range of options. Well, I say huge. There are certainly more options now than there used to be, and I think so. There is a message of hope there. I think for me, I didn't see the drugs as being an option. I think surgery probably is the way forward. I probably thought that from quite an early point, and now there seem to be surgical procedures available that I think could help me, and I think would, you know, have that balance between the result and maintaining my overall quality of life. I don't know if that's an answer.
No, it's a good answer. And I guess what I tell you, I'll ask Howard the same question yourself, and I'll summarize from that side. But yeah, if there's anyone sort of similarly at maybe the beginning of their journey and starting to suffer from symptoms, or equally a bit further in their journey like you are now, is there any sort of advice or anything you'd like to say to anyone in that situation as well?
I'd say three things. I think one is trust yourself. I mean, I think in this area, it's so easy to try and discount or dismiss what you know. So, you know, if you're having these uncomfortable experiences, whatever they are, then trust that they're real would be point one, rather than trying to, you know, I don't get this, doesn't happen to me, I don't get these sorts of things. So trust your experience. The second thing I would say is push back a bit on the medical profession, because I think that there are, I won't say they ignore it, that would be untrue, but you know, sometimes I think this is an area where we have to be a bit persistent, you know, and not be sort of put off by the, oh, well, just take a few antibiotics and you'll be fine or whatever, but to say, no, you know, I want this looked at, I want this investigated, this is impacting my life, you know, take this seriously, refer me to somebody who is a specialist in this area. I mean, GPs with the best network in the world, you know, cover such a range of things. A lot of them are not, I think, specifically knowledgeable enough in this area. And so, and that's not to say some aren't, but I think, you know, sometimes when we go to see a GP, we kind of put them on pedestals, and, you know, anything they say comes from the mouth of God, and we just, you know, swallow it whole. I would say, really, you know, stand for what you know is your experience, ask for a referral, get a specialist to give you an informed opinion. And, you know, in some cases that may mean that nothing is needed, but, you know, I think there are too many people, one, who, you know, it's not okay to talk about it. And even when it is, it's difficult to get access to the appropriate support and help. And I think, you know, in a sense, you're doing it through this process now. I wouldn't quite say a support group, but I think a follow-up as well, where you're able to talk about it, is very helpful. And, you know, it may not be forever, but just to have that opportunity to share experiences when you've been through them with a group of people who've done it. I mean, Andy, you're the first person I know who's been through something similar. That's very reassuring as well. So I think it's those three things. Trust your experience, you know, insist with the GP, or insist with the point of person to get to the right person who has the knowledge and skill to give you an informed opinion, and find or stay engaged with people who can talk about it. I think those three things are essential.
Yeah, I go along with that.
Thank you for sharing those. I guess the main point that I get from both of your responses there, where the crossover certainly is just talking about it. Like you say, it's having that conversation, and it sounds like being open and having that place to do that. One question I would be quite interested in is, you know, it sounds like from both of your experiences today that, like you said, Howard, then this is the first time you've spoken to someone else that is equally had symptoms and going through a similar thing to you. And Andy, you mentioned earlier on that this conversation today was the first, you know, potentially with a group or other people. I'm quite intrigued is, you know, after this, you're, as a demographic, both in that sort of age range of individuals that would be having potentially symptoms of enlarged prostate and probably have friends that may be going through a similar thing. Do you think this is and I'm just, this more curiosity, but like, do you think it's a conversation you might now have with friends about what you've gone through, or equally if they're going through it?
Yeah, I think, I suppose, you know, it's not something I would kind of take a flag and say, oh, I need to talk about this, you know. I think what's changed for me is, you know, and I mean, there are occasions when sort of, you know, I think we are a little bit more open than we may have been a couple of generations ago about things. I would happily, you know, offer my experience. I think it does depend a lot on people's own internal sense of self, their own anxiety. So it's not only what we're able to say, but it's the ability of the person, the recipient, to listen and take it in and not block it out as being, oh, I don't talk about these things, I don't go there. So I think there's those two sides of the coin. You know, there's the sharing, but also getting to a point where it's okay to listen, it's okay to take this information in. You know, you don't have to be in crisis before you're interested. You know, you be more aware. You know, men's health is talked about much more than it used to be, which is, I think, a great thing. But there's still an awful lot of implicit prejudice, I think, out there about, you know, macho men, and, you know, this is not to be talked about. And, you know, if you talk about it, you're somehow, the impression is you're the wimp, you're the weakling, you know, so you get discounted rather than affirmed for being for talking about it.
Yeah. I think that's quite a human thing, and certainly for men, I think, you know, not wishing to appear weak.
So I guess,
sorry. I think particularly for men, that's an issue, not wishing to appear weak.
And I guess on that then, do you feel that potentially by talking about it, that there will be a perception potentially from friends that this is an odd thing to talk about, maybe, or that do you think there's a little bit of that as to why you might not necessarily have that conversation with friends?
I think there's going to be an awkwardness and a you know, it's not going to be an easy conversation, but in some respects, I think it's just, you know, pushing through that discomfort. I mean, I think that takes time, but the more we do it, the more I think it becomes, you know, usual, and people kind of get used to it, even if it's not something that they would easily do. So, you know, again, but I think it is the two things, Joshua. I think it is not only the sort of, you know, the medical information, if I can put it that way. I think that's important, but I think alongside that, it is creating the ability to have a dialogue about it, to have a conversation where you can have a felt experience that you're not on your own with this. I mean, even if when I got those brochures, they were extremely helpful, and I was still on my own with it. It was me with the brochures, and it took me a long way in making a decision about which intervention I wanted, and that's, you know, proved to be very successful. So I appreciate that, but I was still on my own with it. You know, this was me making those decisions with my consultant, and we were the only two people in the world who were doing anything about this. So making it possible to have a conversation, as you've done through this process, I think is absolutely vital to making it, normalizing it. That's the word I'm trying to get to. Normalizing it so it becomes something that isn't an embarrassment or an awkwardness or an avoidance in people, but just it's just another conversation, much as, you know, what are you going to have for tea tonight, or where did you do your shopping last week, or where are you going on holiday? You know, it's just sharing information.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you. That sort of brings an end to my questions.